In 1943, deep beneath the ice, a single German submarine vanished into the white void. No enemy ships, no gunfire, only nature. This is the story of U-703, the U-boat that froze in silence. A mission so remote, so forgotten, that even the men who survived were almost lost to history. There are battlefields the world remembers. Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway, places where millions fought, where the outcome of nations hung in balance, where history was written in blood and steel and the screams of dying men. These are the battles that fill textbooks, inspire films, define how we think about World War II. But there are other battlefields, silent ones. Battlefields without witnesses, without glory, without the dramatic arc of victory or defeat. Battlefields where men fought not against armies, but against the planet itself, against environments so hostile that survival alone constituted victory. The Arctic Ocean was one of these places. A frozen wasteland stretching across the top of the world, where the temperature could drop to -40 degrees Celsius in summer and -60 in winter, where daylight disappeared completely for months during the polar night, where ice stretched endlessly in every direction like a white desert that never ended, never changed, never offered mercy or respite. This was not a place for human beings. Evolution had not prepared us for this environment. Our bodies were not designed for this cold, this darkness, this isolation. And yet, during World War II, both Allied and Axis forces sent men into the Arctic, built stations there, fought battles there, died there in numbers that would never be fully counted. This was not a war of trenches or beaches or urban combat. It was a war of weather, of meteorology, of atmospheric data and barometric pressure readings and temperature gradients. And in this invisible conflict, control of the Arctic meant control of information that could determine the fate of entire campaigns thousands of kilometers to the south. Campaigns where generals moved armies and fleets based on weather forecasts that originated in the frozen north, where small teams of men huddled in stations recording conditions that would shape history. The Arctic Ocean sits at the top of the world, a vast expanse of freezing water covered for much of the year by pack ice that shifts and moves like a living organism responding to currents and wind, and the slow rotation of the planet beneath it. In winter, the ice extends south past northern Norway, past Iceland, past the coast of Greenland, creating barriers that only the most determined or most desperate would attempt to cross. The Norwegian Sea and Barents Sea become hunting grounds where Allied convoys carrying desperately needed supplies to the Soviet Union must navigate through ice floes and storm systems, and the constant threat of German naval forces operating from bases in occupied Norway. But beneath the surface drama of convoy battles and submarine attacks, a quieter war was being fought, a war of information. A war where success was measured not in ships sunk or territory captured, but in the accuracy of weather predictions and the ability to anticipate atmospheric conditions days or weeks in advance. Weather patterns that formed over the Arctic determined conditions across all of Europe. A high-pressure system developing over Greenland could bring clear skies to Germany, perfect conditions for Allied bombing raids that would devastate cities and industrial targets. A storm brewing in the Barents Sea could delay convoy schedules by days or weeks, leaving merchant ships vulnerable to U-boat wolf packs or forcing them to take longer routes that consumed fuel and time. The nation that controlled Arctic weather data controlled tactical advantage across multiple theaters of war, could plan operations with confidence while enemies operated blind. Britain understood this from the beginning. Germany understood this. Even before the war began, both nations had established meteorological stations in the Arctic and subarctic regions, scientific outposts that served dual purposes, advancing understanding of global weather systems and providing military advantage. When war came, these stations took on strategic importance that far exceeded their small size and remote locations. The data they collected, temperature, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, humidity, cloud cover, precipitation, flowed back to meteorological centers where analysts built models and predictions that informed everything from bombing campaigns to naval operations to ground offensives. For Germany, maintaining these Arctic weather stations became increasingly difficult as the war progressed, and Allied naval dominance in the North Atlantic made surface operations dangerous or impossible. Supply ships could be intercepted, bombed, sunk. Aircraft couldn't reliably reach the most remote stations, especially during winter when weather grounded even the hardiest planes and darkness made navigation nearly impossible. That left only one viable option: U-boats. Submarines that could slip beneath the surface, evade detection, navigate through ice fields, surface in narrow leads of open water to deliver supplies and personnel, then disappear back into the depths before Allied patrols could respond. These Arctic supply missions were among the most dangerous operations in the entire Kriegsmarine, not because of enemy action, though that was always a risk, but because of the environment itself. Arctic waters were unpredictable in ways that defied forecasting. Ice charts were outdated the moment they were drawn, obsolete within days as floes drifted and merged and broke apart in patterns that followed no discernible logic. The cold itself became an enemy as deadly as any Allied destroyer. Diesel engines designed for temperate waters struggled in sub-zero temperatures, required constant attention and maintenance to prevent seizing. Batteries lost efficiency in the cold, providing less power for shorter periods. Hydraulic systems that controlled diving planes and rudders could freeze if not properly maintained, turning control surfaces into fixed dead weight. Crews endured weeks of darkness, cramped conditions worse than normal submarine operations, and the constant awareness that if something went catastrophically wrong, if the boat was damaged, if systems failed, if ice trapped them, no rescue would come. The Arctic didn't take prisoners. It didn't negotiate. It simply erased mistakes, swallowed ships and men, and left no evidence they had ever existed. The German High Command in Berlin viewed these Arctic operations as essential despite their cost and risk. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet and later supreme commander of the Kriegsmarine, allocated submarines specifically for weather station support missions despite the desperate need for boats in the Atlantic where the Battle of the Atlantic raged, and where every U-boat could make a difference in the fight to strangle Britain's supply lines. The weather war couldn't be won without data, and data couldn't be collected without stations, and stations couldn't survive without regular resupply, and resupply in the Arctic meant U-boats. It was a chain of dependency that stretched from the frozen north to the halls of power in Berlin, a logistical chain that could break at any link, but that had to be maintained because the alternative, surrendering weather advantage to the Allies, was unacceptable. By 1943, the war had turned decisively against Germany on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder consuming entire armies. North Africa was lost. Italy was wavering. And in the Atlantic, the Allies were finally gaining the upper hand in the submarine war through improved tactics, better technology, more escort ships, and the breaking of German naval codes. U-boat losses were mounting month by month. Crews were younger and less experienced, and the iron ring around Germany was tightening. Every submarine sent to the Arctic was one fewer hunting Allied convoys, one fewer threatening the supply lines that kept Britain fighting, and that would soon support the invasion of Europe. But the weather stations remained operational, their reports still flowing back to Germany, still providing the meteorological intelligence that informed operations across the European theater. And so the Arctic supply missions continued. Dangerous missions, thankless missions, forgotten missions that nobody would remember and that most crews wouldn't survive to talk about. One of these submarines was U-703, a Type VIIC boat of the 11th U-boat flotilla, based in Narvik, Norway, a port on the northern Norwegian coast that served as a forward operating base for U-boats working in Arctic waters. U-703 was not famous. She had sunk no capital ships, participated in no legendary wolf pack attacks, earned no mentions in German propaganda or Allied intelligence reports that would preserve her name for history. She was an ordinary submarine with an ordinary crew doing extraordinary work in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and mechanical reliability. And in the winter of 1943, on a mission that should have been routine insofar as any Arctic operation could be routine, U-703 encountered something that no amount of training or experience could fully prepare her crew for. She encountered the Arctic at its most hostile, its most unforgiving, its most deadly, and she barely survived. U-703 was 67 meters long from bow to stern, displaced 769 tons when surfaced and 871 tons when submerged, and could theoretically dive to depths of 230 meters if her pressure hull could withstand the forces involved, though no commander wanted to test those theoretical limits unless absolutely necessary. She carried a crew that varied between 44 and 52 men depending on mission requirements, and whether specialists were embarked, officers who knew navigation and tactics, petty officers who managed divisions and maintained discipline, machinists who understood the temperamental diesel engines and electric motors, torpedo men who maintained weapons that might never be fired, radio operators who decoded messages and maintained contact with distant command centers. All of them crammed into a steel tube with barely enough room to move, and certainly not enough room for privacy or comfort. The interior of a Type VIIC was a study in claustrophobic efficiency. Every cubic centimeter served a purpose. The forward torpedo room housed 4 tubes, and the reload torpedoes stored in racks, weapons that weighed over a ton each, and had to be manhandled into position by crews working in spaces barely large enough for men to stand. Behind the torpedo room came crew berthing, bunks stacked 3 high against the curved hull, thin mattresses that never quite dried from the constant condensation, lockers for personal gear that had to be ruthlessly minimized because space was luxury the boat couldn't afford. The control room was the nerve center, packed with valves and gauges and wheels and levers, diving planes controlled by helmsmen who learned to feel the boat's trim through subtle pressure changes, periscopes that could be raised to scan the surface or lowered to prevent damage, navigation tables where officers plotted courses on charts that were always too old and never quite accurate. After the control room came the galley, if such a grand term could be applied to a tiny space with a small electric stove and minimal storage, where the cook performed miracles with canned goods and preserved foods, and whatever fresh provisions they carried that would spoil within days. Behind that, the diesel engine room and electric motor room, spaces that were too hot when the diesels ran and too cold when they didn't, machinery that required constant attention, and that filled the boat with noise and vibration and fumes that permeated everything. And finally, the aft torpedo room with its single tube, more storage, more cramped berthing for the crew stationed there. The whole thing was held together by rivets and welds, and the collective will of men who trusted their lives to steel that was never quite thick enough. Privacy didn't exist aboard U-703. Neither did silence. The boat was always making noise, machinery running, water rushing past the hull, men moving and talking and working. The air was always thick with smells. Diesel fumes that nothing could quite eliminate, unwashed bodies after weeks at sea, when bathing meant a quick wipe with a damp cloth if you were lucky, food cooking or rotting depending on how long since the last port call, the metallic tang of machinery, and the chemical smell of battery gases that sometimes leaked despite precautions. Sleep came in shifts, watches rotating every 4 hours, men collapsing into bunks still warm from the previous occupant, trying to rest despite noise and discomfort, and the constant awareness that they were underwater in a steel tube that could become a tomb if anything went wrong. Meals were eaten cold more often than hot because cooking consumed electricity that batteries might need for more critical systems. Coffee, when it was available, tasted like metal from the water distilled from seawater, bitter and lukewarm and precious nonetheless. Bread was baked fresh during the first days of a patrol but quickly went stale, and then moldy in the damp atmosphere, rationed carefully because flour had to last weeks. Canned meat, canned vegetables, canned everything, monotonous and nutritionally questionable, but sufficient to keep men functioning if not thriving. Every surface was either too hot from contact with engines or too cold from proximity to the surrounding water. Nothing was comfortable. Comfort wasn't part of the design specifications. The commander of U-703 was a career naval officer in his early 30s, a man who had joined the Kriegsmarine before the war and who had spent years learning the subtle and deadly art of submarine warfare. He understood the delicate balance between aggression and caution that kept boats and crews alive in a service where 3 out of 4 submarines never returned from patrol. He knew his boat intimately, her quirks, her capabilities, her limits. He knew his crew by name and by nature, knew which men could be trusted in a crisis, and which needed careful supervision, knew who would crack under pressure, and who would find reserves of strength when everything seemed lost. He had brought U-703 through multiple patrols already, had dodged depth charges dropped by destroyers that pinged away with sonar trying to find him, had successfully attacked Allied shipping in the Atlantic before being reassigned to the Arctic theater. He had earned the quiet respect of men who didn't give respect easily, men who understood that their survival depended on his decisions and his judgment and his ability to stay calm when the world was trying to kill them. But the Arctic missions were different from the Atlantic convoy attacks. These weren't hunts where you stalked prey and struck from ambush and then fled before escorts could counterattack. These were deliveries, logistics, support work, less glorious than combat, less likely to earn medals or mentions in dispatches, but no less dangerous. Perhaps more dangerous because the enemy in the Arctic wasn't always the Allies with their destroyers and aircraft. The enemy was the environment itself, nature at its most hostile, cold and ice and darkness that didn't care about flags or ideologies or the grand strategies of distant generals. The crew of U-703 knew what they had signed up for. They were volunteers, all of them, men who had chosen the U-boat service despite, or perhaps because of its reputation as one of the most hazardous assignments in the entire German military. U-boat crews suffered casualty rates higher than almost any other branch of service. The numbers were stark and getting starker as the war progressed and Allied anti-submarine tactics improved. Men who served aboard U-boats were fatalistic by nature or became so quickly, bound together by shared danger, and the knowledge that survival depended on every man doing his job perfectly every time because one mistake, one moment of inattention, one equipment failure at the wrong time could kill everyone aboard. They were young, most of them in their 20s, old enough to understand mortality but young enough to believe, or at least to hope, that they might be among the lucky ones who made it through. They came from all over Germany and occupied territories, from cities and farms and small towns, bringing with them the dialects and customs and superstitions of their regions. Some had joined for ideological reasons, believers in the cause. Some had joined for practical reasons, because submarine service paid better than surface fleet and hazard bonuses accumulated quickly for those who survived to collect them. Some had joined because someone had to, and they happened to be available when their number came up. The reasons mattered less than the fact that they were here, aboard U-703, preparing for another Arctic mission that would test them in ways they probably didn't fully comprehend yet. The mission briefing had been straightforward in the way military briefings always were, presenting simple objectives without dwelling on complications that would become obvious soon enough. Proceed north from Narvik into the Barents Sea. Navigate through the ice fields to a rendezvous point near one of the meteorological stations. The exact location would be transmitted en route via encrypted radio once they were safely away from port, and potential Allied surveillance. Deliver supplies that were already being loaded aboard, crates of preserved food, fuel drums for the station's generators, spare parts for radio equipment, batteries, medical supplies, mail from home for men who hadn't seen Germany in months. Retrieve any personnel scheduled for rotation, though that seemed unlikely given how few replacements were available and how much demand there was for experienced Arctic hands. Return to Narvik. Simple. 2 weeks, perhaps 3 depending on ice conditions and Allied patrol activity. Routine. As routine as anything in the Arctic could be, which was to say not routine at all. U-703 departed Narvik on a gray morning in late January 1943. The fjord was calm, the sky overcast with low clouds that promised snow, the temperature hovering just below freezing. The crew had spent the previous days loading supplies, stowing gear with the practiced efficiency of men who knew exactly how much space they had and where everything needed to go, performing final checks of all systems that would keep them alive in the days ahead. The diesel engines rumbled to life, their deep thrumming sound echoing off the fjord walls. Mooring lines were cast off from the dock, splashing into dark water. The boat moved slowly away from the pier, past other U-boats in various states of repair or preparation, past supply vessels and patrol boats and the industrial infrastructure that supported submarine operations, out toward the open sea beyond the fjord mouth. Some men stood on the conning tower bridge taking what might be their last look at land for weeks, breathing air that didn't smell of diesel and sweat, watching the coast recede. Others remained below, already settling into the routines that would dominate their lives for the duration of the patrol, checking equipment one more time, securing loose items, preparing for the transition from port to operational patrol. The Norwegian Sea greeted them with moderate swells and temperatures just above freezing, cold, but not yet the killing cold they would encounter further north. U-703 ran on the surface, making good speed, her diesels charging the massive banks of batteries that would power her electric motors when she needed to dive or when running submerged beneath ice. The commander kept watches rotating every 4 hours, radar operators monitoring primitive sets for aircraft that might appear over the horizon, lookouts scanning with binoculars for enemy ships or suspicious contacts, everyone aware that even here, relatively close to base, they were in contested waters where Allied aircraft conducted patrols and where running on the surface was always a calculated risk. During daylight hours, they maintained strict radio silence, except for brief coded transmissions that announced their position to headquarters and confirmed they were proceeding according to plan. At night they surfaced fully, running with minimal lighting, navigating by stars when clouds permitted and by dead reckoning when they didn't. The cook prepared hot meals that men savored while they could because hot meals would become luxury once they entered the ice and conserving battery power became critical. Coffee flowed freely from the urn in the galley, strong and bitter, and caffeinated enough to keep men alert through watches that seemed to stretch forever in the darkness. As they moved north, degree by degree of latitude, the temperature dropped steadily. -5 Celsius, -10, -15. Ice began appearing in the water, first as isolated chunks floating past like discarded puzzle pieces, then as larger flows that required careful navigation to avoid, finally as continuous sheets that forced them to seek narrow channels of open water called leads that might close behind them or ahead of them without warning. The pack ice here was not static. It moved with currents and wind, opening and closing passages unpredictably, shifting positions overnight so that charts drawn one day were obsolete the next. The crew could hear it outside the hull even when submerged, grinding, creaking, the sound of millions of tons of ice in constant slow motion, colliding and fracturing and freezing together, a soundscape unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. Life aboard U-703 settled into its particular rhythm, the routine that submarines developed at sea where time became marked not by sunlight and darkness, but by watches and meals and the constant cycle of work and rest that kept the boat operational. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off. 4 hours monitoring gauges, adjusting trim, scanning sonar returns, maintaining course, staying alert for any sign of danger or mechanical problem. Then 4 hours of attempted rest in bunks that were never comfortable, in air that was too humid or too dry or too thick with fumes, while the boat continued its mission and other men took over the watches. The machinists worked constantly in the engine rooms, checking oil levels that had to be maintained precisely, adjusting fuel mixtures for engines that didn't like the cold, listening with trained ears for any irregularity in the mechanical symphony that could indicate developing problems. The radio operators sat at their stations monitoring frequencies, decoding messages that came in bursts of static-filled transmission, transmitting brief status reports when conditions permitted, and when radio silence could be safely broken. The torpedo men maintained their weapons even though this mission called for supplies rather than combat, keeping mechanisms clean and functional because you never knew when you might encounter a target of opportunity or need to defend against attack. Everyone did their job because doing your job was what kept the boat functioning and the crew alive, and because submarine service instilled a culture where shirking responsibility meant putting everyone at risk. The commander lived mostly in the control room, catnapping on a fold-down bunk when exhaustion demanded it, but never truly sleeping, always aware of the boat's status, always ready to respond to emergency or opportunity. He studied ice charts that were weeks out of date, compared them to observations from the periscope and reports from lookouts, plotted courses based on educated guesswork and experience, because complete information didn't exist and wouldn't exist until satellites decades in the future could provide real-time ice coverage. He made decisions with incomplete data because complete data was impossible, chose routes that balanced speed against safety, that kept them moving north toward the rendezvous point while avoiding areas where ice looked too thick or too active or too likely to trap an unwary submarine. The crew ate together in shifts in the tiny galley, sharing space and food and the black humor that military men develop as defense against circumstances they can't control. They told jokes that weren't funny and laughed anyway. They complained about the food in the way that soldiers have complained about military food since armies were invented, complaining because it was tradition, and because the alternatives to complaining were thinking too much about where they were and what they were doing. They wrote letters home on whatever paper they could find, long rambling letters that wouldn't be mailed until they returned to Nuvok, and that might never be mailed if they didn't return, but writing them anyway because the act of writing connected them to a world beyond steel hull and frozen ocean. Some men played cards using dog-eared decks that had seen dozens of patrols, playing for cigarettes or chocolate rations or simple bragging rights, because actual money was useless aboard a submarine. Some read books if they had managed to bring any aboard, reading by dim electric light that flickered occasionally when power fluctuated, losing themselves in stories that took them anywhere but here. Some simply stared at nothing, retreating into their own thoughts, processing the stress and isolation in whatever way their minds found workable. But the Arctic doesn't care about routines or coping mechanisms or the psychological needs of submarine crews. Weather systems formed over the Arctic Ocean with frightening speed, grew from minor disturbances to full storms in hours, moved in directions that defied prediction. What began as light snow squalls became a full blizzard, wind whipping across the ice at speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour, visibility dropping to nothing even on the rare occasions when they surfaced. The temperature plummeted, -20 degrees, -30, -35. Metal became so cold that bare skin would freeze to it instantly, would tear away leaving blood and flesh stuck to steel. The crew wore every layer they had, huddled near the engines for warmth when off watch, moved carefully to avoid touching exposed metal surfaces that could cause instant frostbite. The storm lasted 3 days and 3 nights, though day and night had little meaning in the polar winter, where the sun barely crept above the horizon even at noon, and where darkness was the default state of existence. 3 days of running blind beneath the ice, of navigating by dead reckoning because periscope observation was impossible and surfacing was suicidal, of hopping the ice charts were accurate enough to keep them out of danger, and knowing that hope was about all they had. The storm battered the ice above them, drove floes together with tremendous force, created pressure ridges where colliding sheets buckled and piled up into jagged barriers that extended both above and below the waterline. When the storm finally cleared enough for them to attempt periscope depth and observation, they found themselves in unfamiliar waters surrounded by ice that had shifted dramatically from what charts predicted. The leads they had planned to follow were gone, sealed by ice that had moved during the storm. New leads had opened, but in directions that didn't match their desired course. Landmarks, insofar as frozen seascapes could have landmarks, had changed. Pressure ridges that should have been kilometers to the west were now directly ahead. Open water that charts showed should exist was now solid pack ice extending to the horizon. The commander ordered a careful survey, sending active sonar pings into the depths below, and the ice above despite the risk that Allied hydrophone networks might detect them, because navigating blind in these conditions was more dangerous than potential detection. The sonar returns painted a picture in sound. Ice ceiling 3 to 5 meters thick in most areas, thicker where pressure ridges had formed, occasional thin spots where leads might allow surfacing if they could reach them. The depth beneath them was adequate, several hundred meters of water, but the geography of the ice above was the critical factor now. They were off course, not drastically in terms of linear distance, but significantly in terms of navigation options. The storm had pushed them into an area where ice was heavier and more consolidated than their outdated charts indicated. More concerning, the ice ahead showed no obvious leads, no channels of open water that would allow them to continue north on the surface, or even to find spots where surfacing was possible. They were trapped beneath a ceiling of ice with unclear paths forward, and no guarantee that retracing their route would be possible given how much the ice had shifted. The commander faced the decision that would define this patrol, and that would test every man aboard. They could turn back, attempt to retrace their course through ice that had already proven unreliable, give up on the mission and return to Narvik having failed to deliver the supplies that men at the weather station were depending on. Or they could continue forward beneath the ice, trusting that conditions would improve closer to their destination, trusting that leads would open, trusting in experience and skill and luck because sometimes luck was the only factor you could control. He chose to continue. They had come too far to turn back without attempting to complete the mission. The weather station needed those supplies. Men were counting on them. And retreating felt like surrender, like admitting the Arctic had beaten them before they had exhausted every option and tried every possible route. It was a commander's decision, the kind that careers and lives depended on, made with inadequate information and no good alternatives, but made nonetheless because submarines didn't carry committees and decisive action, was better than paralysis even when the decision might be wrong. U-703 turned north again and slipped beneath the consolidated pack ice like a steel fish entering a cave, leaving behind the last channels of open water, committing fully to running submerged until they found another break in the ice ceiling. The diesel engines shut down. They required air to operate, needed ventilation to exhaust their fumes, couldn't run while submerged. The electric motors took over, drawing power from batteries, running quieter than diesels but with limited endurance measured in hours rather than days. The boat became suddenly quieter with the diesels stopped. No more rumbling engine noise, no more vibration through the hull. Just the smooth hum of electric motors, the whisper of water flowing past, the soft creaking of the pressure hull adjusting to depth, and the occasional ping of sonar checking their clearance above and below. The crew felt the change immediately even though no announcement was made. Submerged operations beneath ice carried different risks than surface running or normal submerged operations in open water. There was nowhere to surface in emergency, no way to ventilate the boat, no ability to run diesels to recharge batteries. They were operating on a clock now, battery endurance measured against the distance they needed to cover and the time it would take to find suitable surfacing location. And if they didn't find one before batteries died, they would be dead in the water, drifting powerless beneath the ice with no way to move and no way to breathe for much longer. The periscope couldn't be raised. There was nowhere to break surface, no point to visual observation when ice extended overhead in every direction. Sonar became their only sense, painting pictures of their environment in echoes and returns, showing them the ice ceiling above and the ocean floor below, and occasionally detecting gaps or thin spots that might represent leads. The commander ordered minimum speed, just enough to maintain steerage, conserving battery power for the long hours ahead. He ordered all non-essential systems shut down, lights dimmed to minimum, heating reduced. Every piece of equipment that drew power and wasn't necessary for immediate survival turned off. The boat became colder as the heating system cycled down, became dimmer as lighting was reduced, became more confined as men were ordered to remain in bunks when not on watch to minimize movement and oxygen consumption. Hours passed in that strange twilight state of submerged operations beneath Arctic ice. The crew rotated through watches as usual, but with a heightened awareness that normal watch routines didn't fully capture. Everyone could feel the ice above them, could imagine it closing in, could sense the precariousness of their situation, even if they didn't voice those thoughts aloud. Men who tried to sleep found themselves staring at the hull inches from their faces, listening to every sound, wondering if that creak was normal thermal contraction or something more sinister. Men on watch maintained their stations with extra vigilance, monitoring gauges that tracked depth and trim and battery charge, with an intensity that came from understanding how critical those numbers had become. The sonar operator called out ice thickness measurements every few minutes, steady readings that confirmed they were still running beneath solid pack ice with no obvious breaks. 3 meters thick, 4 meters, 5 meters in some places where pressure had compacted the ice. The commander plotted their position as best he could without GPS or stellar navigation, relying on dead reckoning and the boat's compass and estimates of speed and drift, knowing that every calculation carried margins of error that would accumulate over time. They were roughly on course for the rendezvous point, but roughly was the best certainty available. Carbon dioxide levels began rising as they always did during extended submerged operations. The air scrubbers worked constantly, chemical filters absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere and releasing oxygen from stored tanks, but the system was designed for standard submerged operations with regular surfacing to ventilate. Extended time beneath ice pushed the scrubbers beyond their intended design parameters. The air took on a strange quality, became thicker, heavier, harder to breathe fully even though oxygen levels remained technically adequate. Men began experiencing subtle symptoms, headaches that started as mild pressure behind the eyes and gradually intensified, nausea that came and went in waves, difficulty concentrating on tasks that should be routine, a general sense of fatigue that rest didn't relieve. The commander recognized these signs from previous long-duration submerged operations. They weren't critical yet, weren't immediately dangerous, but they were warning indicators that time was becoming a factor. He consulted with the chief engineer about battery endurance, received estimates that they could maintain current operations for perhaps another 12 to 18 hours before battery charge dropped to levels where they would need to surface regardless of ice conditions. 12 to 18 hours. Not a hard deadline but a soft one, a window that was closing gradually but inexorably. He ordered non-essential personnel to remain in bunks even when off watch, to minimize activity and oxygen consumption, to essentially hibernate until conditions improved. Some men understood the order for what it was, a conservation measure that meant their situation was more serious than routine. Others simply followed orders because that's what you did in the military, trusting that command knew what they were doing even when the reasons weren't fully explained. The boat became quieter still as men settled into bunks and stopped moving around, as conversation ceased, as the human sounds that normally filled the submarine diminished until only the sounds of machinery remained. U-703 continued north, beneath ice that showed no signs of thinning, through water that was barely above freezing, toward a destination that had to exist somewhere ahead because the alternative was unthinkable. The sonar operator continued calling out readings mechanically, his voice the only regular human sound. 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters, like a mantra, like a countdown, like a reminder that they were still trapped beneath a ceiling that could kill them as easily as any enemy weapon. Then the sonar detected something different. Not thinner ice, the ceiling remained solid, but a change in the underwater topography below them. The bottom was rising, depth decreasing from 400 meters to 300 to 200. They were approaching shallower waters, likely nearing the underwater shelf that extended from some Arctic island or landmass. Shallower water was both good and bad. Good because it suggested they were nearing their destination area, where islands and coastlines might create ice patterns different from the open pack ice. Bad because it reduced their margin for error in depth control, and because shallow water sometimes meant more complex ice formations. The commander ordered a slight course adjustment, following the rising bottom contour. Hopping it would lead them to more favorable ice conditions. The boat rose slightly to maintain clearance from the bottom, still running beneath the ice ceiling, but now with less vertical space to maneuver. The crew felt the change in the boat's attitude, the slight nose-up trim that indicated rising toward shallower depth, and understood without being told that something had changed in their situation. And then, without warning, the bow hydroplane jammed. It happened silently at first, no dramatic sound or visible failure, just a gradual realization that the control surface wasn't responding to inputs. The helmsman noticed it first, felt the stiffness in the control wheel, reported it to the diving officer who immediately tried manual override. Nothing. The bow plane was locked in place, frozen solid, unresponsive to any input mechanical or electrical. The chief engineer was summoned, arrived at the control room within seconds, began diagnostics to determine the cause. His verdict was immediate and damning. Ice. Ice had formed inside the hydroplane mechanism, probably condensation that had frozen in the sub-zero temperatures, expanding and locking the mechanism. The bow plane was seized solid and wouldn't move without extensive repairs that couldn't be performed while submerged. This was catastrophically bad. The bow and stern hydroplanes were the boat's primary means of controlling depth and attitude. With the bow plane jammed, they had only the stern planes and careful ballast adjustments to maintain trim and depth. The boat immediately became harder to control, nose-down attitude developing as weight distribution changed, requiring constant corrections from the helmsman and diving officer. And they were still beneath solid ice with nowhere to surface, still running on battery power that was depleting, still dealing with rising CO2 levels and an air quality that was degrading hourly. The commander's expression didn't change, but every man in the control room could sense the shift in atmosphere, the sudden increase in tension, the recognition that their situation had gone from difficult to desperate. They couldn't surface to repair the plane, ice prevented that. They couldn't continue indefinitely with degraded depth control. Eventually, the batteries would die or they would make a mistake and either hit the ice ceiling or sink too deep. They had to find open water soon, had to surface, had to address multiple compounding problems before they cascaded into total catastrophe. The chief engineer tried every option he could think of without surfacing. He sent men into the forward torpedo room where the hydroplane controls ran. Hopping manual intervention might free the mechanism. They tried heating the area with portable equipment, tried applying mechanical force to break the ice, tried everything that could be done from inside the pressure hull. Nothing worked. The mechanism was frozen solid. Ice welded metal to metal with grip that mechanical advantage couldn't break in heat, couldn't quickly melt given the ambient cold. Meanwhile, the boat became harder to control with every passing minute. The helmsman and diving officer worked continuously to maintain level trim, using only the stern planes and ballast adjustments, making constant microcorrections that consumed attention and energy and introduced lag into their responses. The boat wanted to pitch nose down with the jammed bow plane, wanted to sink or surface unpredictably as weight shifted and water moved through ballast tanks. Maintaining depth within the narrow envelope between ice ceiling and safe operating depth required constant vigilance and perfect coordination between helmsman, diving officer, and trim party managing ballast. The commander reduced speed to absolute minimum, just barely enough to maintain steerage, because higher speeds amplified the control problems and increased the risk of sudden depth changes they couldn't correct in time. They crept forward through the dark water, meters per minute instead of knots per hour, sonar still pinging ahead and above searching for any break in the ice that might allow them to surface. Battery charge continued dropping, 70% remaining, 60%, 50%. Each percentage point represented finite electrical energy being consumed to run motors and lights and air scrubbers and all the systems that kept the boat functional and the crew alive. The chief engineer provided regular updates to the commander, updates that were really countdowns. At current consumption rate, they had 8 hours of useful charge remaining. 7 hours. 6 hours. After that, they would still have some reserve power, but not enough to maneuver effectively. Not enough to maintain life support at full capacity. Not enough to do anything except drift and wait for batteries to die completely. The air quality deteriorated further. CO2 scrubbers were running at maximum capacity, but they couldn't quite keep pace with the accumulated exhalations of 50 men in a sealed steel tube. The headaches intensified, moved from background discomfort to active pain. Some men felt nauseous, fought to keep down the meager meals they had eaten hours earlier. Others felt dizzy, lightheaded, disconnected from their bodies as if watching themselves from outside. The commander ordered oxygen released from storage tanks to supplement the scrubbers, an emergency measure that would help temporarily, but that consumed reserves they might need later, and that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Still they moved north. Still the ice remained solid overhead, 3 meters thick, 4 meters, 5 meters in places. The sonar return showed an unbroken ceiling extending in every direction. Pack ice that had consolidated during the storm, and that showed no obvious leads or thin sections where breaking through might be possible. Men lay in their bunks trying to conserve energy and oxygen, trying not to think about what would happen if they didn't find open water soon, trying not to calculate how many hours of air they had left or how cold it would get when battery power died completely and heating failed, and the Arctic cold seeped through the hull unopposed. Some men prayed, quiet prayers in half a dozen languages and denominations, praying to whatever gods they believed in because prayer cost nothing and maybe helped and definitely couldn't hurt. Some men simply stared at the hull centimeters from their faces, retreated into themselves, waited with the fatalism that submarine crews developed or didn't survive to develop. The sonar operator's voice had become monotonous, calling out readings every few minutes in a tone that suggested he no longer expected them to change. 3 meters, 4 meters, 3.5 meters, 4 meters, an endless litany of bad news delivered in measured tones that somehow made it worse than if he had shown emotion. Then, hours into their desperate search, the sonar detected something different. Not thinner ice exactly, but a section where the return showed irregularities, variations in thickness, patterns that might indicate fracture or weakness. The commander ordered course adjustment toward the anomaly, hope rising despite every instinct that said hope was dangerous in their situation. The sonar continued providing updates as they approached, 2.5 meters thick in one spot, 3 meters adjacent, 2 meters in another location. Variable thickness, potentially fractured, possibly thin enough to break through if they could hit it with enough force at the right angle. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't even good. It was simply less bad than everything else they had found, and at this point less bad was good enough. The commander calculated their remaining battery power, consulted with the chief engineer about how much energy they could dedicate to an emergency blow without leaving themselves unable to maneuver afterward, made the decision that commanding officers get paid to make even when every option is bad. They would attempt an emergency surface, not through standard surfacing procedures which assumed open water and normal conditions, but through sheer force and desperation. They would position beneath the thinnest section of ice the sonar had detected, blow all main ballast tanks simultaneously using high-pressure compressed air, drive the boat upward as fast as physics and engineering would allow, and hit the ice ceiling with whatever momentum they could generate in the short distance available. They would either break through and surface, or they would crack the hull trying, or they would bounce off the ice and sink back down to try again with even less battery power remaining. Those were the options. None of them were good, but staying beneath the ice until batteries died and they suffocated was guaranteed death, so even bad options were better than no options. The commander explained the plan in terse sentences, laying out the procedure and the risks without sugarcoating anything, because these were professional submariners who understood their situation and deserved honesty. Some men nodded, accepting what had to be done. Some made signs of the cross or touched lucky charms or engaged in whatever personal rituals gave them comfort. The commander ordered all hands to brace positions, to secure anything loose, to grab handholds and prepare for violent motion and possible disaster. U-703 maneuvered slowly to position beneath the target section of ice. The sonar operator talked them in, providing constant updates on their alignment, 50 meters to target, 40 meters, 30, 20, 10. When they were directly beneath the thin section, the commander ordered all stop. The boat drifted to motionless hover, electric motors shut down, trim balanced as perfectly as conditions allowed. For a moment everything was quiet. No engine noise, no machinery running. Just the sound of men breathing in air that tasted wrong and felt heavy. Just the subtle sounds of the hull creaking under pressure. Just the collective tension of 50 men about to bet their lives on a desperate gamble. The commander gave the order, blow all main ballast, emergency surface, now. The compressed air system activated with a sound like a cannon firing in an enclosed space, a roar that seemed impossibly loud after the enforced quiet, high-pressure air screaming through pipes into the ballast tanks, forcing water out through flood ports, replacing mass with buoyancy. The effect was immediate and dramatic. U-703 became suddenly lighter than the surrounding water, became subject to buoyant force that drove her upward with acceleration that pinned men against deck plates and bunks and bulkheads. The depth gauge unwound rapidly. 100 meters, 80, 60, 40, 20. The boat rose through the dark water at speeds that were never intended by her designers, rose toward ice that was rushing to meet her, rose with momentum that couldn't be stopped now even if they wanted to stop it. Men braced themselves, gripped handholds with white-knuckled intensity, waited for impact that they could hear coming but couldn't prepare for, impact that would either free them or kill them and nothing in between. The conning tower hit first, struck the ice ceiling with tremendous force, transmitted shock through the entire hull like a bell being struck with a hammer. The sound was enormous, overwhelming, a crash that made men's ears ring and made loose equipment clatter even though everything was supposed to be secured. The boat shuddered, every frame and rivet and weld transmitting the impact, every man feeling it through whatever surface they were braced against. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The boat hung there, tower pressed against ice from below, hull suspended in water, neither breaking through nor falling back. The compressed air continued forcing water from ballast tanks, continued generating buoyancy, continued pushing upward with force that made metal groan and ice crack. Pressure gauges fluctuated wildly as forces balanced on knife edge, as physics decided whether steel would yield or ice would break or something else would fail catastrophically. Then they heard it, the ice cracking. Not the sharp crack of something breaking cleanly, but a deep groaning sound, a sound like the planet protesting, a sound that built and built until it seemed the ice itself was screaming. Fracture lines propagated through the frozen ceiling above them, spreading from the impact point, weakening the structure, creating failure zones where the ice could no longer support its own weight against the force pushing from below. The conning tower penetrated, broke through the ice layer, punched into air and light. The boat surged upward, momentum carrying her through the weakened ice, breaking apart the fractured sections, cascading frozen water off her sides. The forward deck emerged, throwing off chunks of ice, the hull rising from the frozen ocean like some mechanical leviathan from ancient myth. More ice shattered and fell away as the boat continued rising, kept rising until buoyancy and momentum balanced, and she settled at surface trim, floating in a pool of broken ice and open water that she had created through sheer force. They were through on the surface, alive. Men released breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. Some laughed, high, slightly hysterical sounds that came from tension releasing all at once. Some simply slumped in place, energy draining as adrenaline faded. Some remained frozen in brace positions, unable to process immediately that the crisis was over, that they had survived. The commander climbed the ladder to the conning tower, threw open the hatch with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Arctic air poured into the boat, brutal cold that felt like being slapped, air so pure after hours of breathing recycled atmosphere that it almost hurt to inhale. He emerged onto the bridge, looked around at a frozen world that seemed simultaneously hostile and beautiful, endless white in every direction broken only by pressure ridges, and the dark water of the lead they had surfaced into. The temperature was minus 38 degrees Celsius. Wind cut through his cold weather gear like it wasn't there, found skin and stole heat with ruthless efficiency. But it was air, real air, unlimited air, and after hours beneath the ice that was the most precious commodity in existence. He called down orders to start the diesel engines, to begin charging batteries, to ventilate the boat, to get heating systems back to full power, to begin the process of returning the submarine to full operational status. The diesels coughed once, twice, caught and rumbled to life, their sound the most beautiful thing the crew had heard in days. Generators spun up, began converting mechanical energy to electrical, began recharging battery banks that had come dangerously close to complete discharge. Fresh air poured through open hatches, driven through compartments by ventilation fans, purging the stale atmosphere, carrying away the accumulated smells and the thick, heavy quality that had made breathing difficult. Men began emerging from their paralyzed states, moving again, talking again, returning to their duties with renewed energy that came from survival and relief. The cook heated real coffee, not the lukewarm recycled version but fresh hot coffee made with clean water, distributed it to the crew who savored it like fine wine. Some men came topside despite the brutal cold, needed to see sky even if it was gray and overcast, needed to feel space around them even if it was frozen wasteland, needed visual confirmation that they were actually on the surface and not still trapped below. The chief engineer worked on the hydroplane mechanism, now accessible from outside the hull, chipping away ice with tools and muscle and determination. The ice had frozen solid in the mechanism during their submerged run. Condensation turned to ice in the below-zero temperatures, expanding and seizing the controls. With the boat surfaced and diesels running, he could apply heat and force that hadn't been possible before. Slowly, grudgingly, the mechanism began responding. Metal moved fractionally, then more. then finally broke free entirely as the ice shattered under combined heat and mechanical advantage. He tested it repeatedly, worked it through full range of motion until satisfied it would function normally, then reported to the commander that the boat was fully operational again. They remained surfaced for 6 hours, running diesels continuously, charging batteries to maximum capacity, ventilating every corner of the submarine, warming the interior to temperatures that felt tropical compared to what they had endured. The crew rotated through watches and rest, ate hot food, breathed air that didn't taste wrong, recovered physically and psychologically from the ordeal. The commander consulted charts and navigation plots, calculated their position as precisely as limited data allowed, determined they were roughly 20 kilometers from the rendezvous point, and that the lead they had surfaced into extended generally in the direction they needed to go. They could proceed on the surface through the lead, make better time, avoid the risks of running beneath ice with the memory of near disaster fresh in everyone's mind. U-703 got underway again, moving through the lead at moderate speed, diesels pushing her through water that was barely above freezing, past ice floes and small bergs, under skis that remained gray and threatening. The crew had settled into a different mood now, quieter than before, more introspective. They had come within hours of death. Not combat death from enemy action, but suffocation death trapped beneath ice. The kind of death that would have left no trace, no wreckage for anyone to find, just a submarine that never returned, and a crew that vanished into Arctic silence. They reached the rendezvous point late the following day, finding an area where currents kept water relatively ice-free, a natural pool large enough for submarine operations. The commander transmitted the prearranged signal on encrypted frequencies, received acknowledgement from the weather station shore party. The transfer would begin immediately while conditions permitted and while the lead remained open. The weather station personnel came out in a small boat, 6 men who looked like they had aged years in the months since their last supply delivery. Their faces were weathered, their movements careful and deliberate, their eyes carrying the particular quality that came from extended isolation in extreme environments. They supervised loading of supplies from U-703's deck, crates of food, fuel drums that had to be manhandled across shifting ice, spare parts for radio equipment that was their only link to the world, medical supplies that might mean the difference between surviving injury or dying from it, mail from home carrying news that was weeks old but still precious. The transfer took 4 hours of cold, exhausting work. Men from U-703 helped, forming human chains to pass equipment, working together despite fatigue and the brutal temperature because getting this done quickly meant everyone could get back to relative safety sooner. There was little conversation. The cold made talking difficult and energy was better spent on work. But there was mutual understanding, acknowledgement between submarine crew and station personnel that they were all far from home doing impossible work that few would appreciate. When the last crate was transferred and the last fuel drum secured, the weather station leader came aboard briefly to speak with U-703's commander. They shared coffee in the wardroom, talked quietly about conditions and situations, and the war that seemed very distant from this frozen corner of the world. The station leader reported that their work was productive, that the meteorological data they collected was valuable, that they were managing despite hardships. He didn't mention the isolation or the darkness or the cold that never stopped or the psychological toll of months in a place where the sun barely rose and human contact was reduced to 6 other men who had become too familiar. He didn't need to mention it. The commander understood. Everyone understood. No personnel rotated. Everyone assigned to the weather station would remain until the next scheduled relief, which might be months away depending on war conditions and available transport. The station crew would endure another Arctic winter, would continue their mission, would hope that submarines like U-703 would continue making the dangerous supply runs that kept them alive. The weather station party departed back to shore, small boat disappearing into the gray distance. U-703 remained on the surface for a few more hours, ensuring batteries were fully charged, that all systems were operational, that they were as prepared as possible for the return journey to Narvik. The commander plotted a course that would keep them in the lead as long as possible before they had to venture beneath ice again. A course that prioritized safety over speed because they had completed their mission, and getting home was now the only objective that mattered. The return journey took 11 days, longer than the outbound voyage but safer, more cautious. They traveled mostly on the surface when ice permitted, diving only when necessary to avoid detection or when ice forced them below. The crew remained quiet, processing what had happened, each man dealing in his own way with the knowledge of how close they had come to dying. Some wrote more letters home, trying to capture in words something that probably couldn't be expressed. Some retreated into routine, found comfort in the familiar rhythms of submarine operations. Some simply waited, marking time until Narvik appeared on the horizon and this patrol would officially end. They encountered no enemy action during the return. Allied patrols missed them or were elsewhere or simply got lucky in the vast emptiness of Arctic waters, where finding a single submarine was like finding one particular snowflake in a blizzard. The ice gradually thinned as they moved south, leads became more common, open water appeared more frequently. The temperature rose from -40 to -30 to -20, still brutally cold but less lethal, less immediately dangerous. U-703 entered Narvik Fjord on an afternoon in mid-February, 13 days after departing, diesel engines rumbling peacefully as she approached the submarine piers. Some crew members stood on the conning tower bridge looking at land and civilization and buildings that represented safety and comfort, and all the things they had gone without. Others remained below, already beginning the mental transition from patrol mode to port mode, from heightened alertness to relative relaxation. The boat secured to the dock without ceremony. Mooring lines were thrown and caught and made fast. The engines shut down. The crew disembarked, carrying personal gear, filing off the boat in the organized chaos that always accompanied return from patrol. They would undergo debriefing, would submit reports, would answer questions from intelligence officers and operational commanders who wanted to know everything about ice conditions and Allied activity, and how the supply transfer went. The commander wrote his patrol report over the next few days, documenting dates and positions and activities in the clinical language that military reports required. The near disaster beneath the ice was recorded with professional detachment. Encountered heavy pack ice. Temporary difficulty surfacing due to consolidated ice conditions and mechanical issues. Resolved through emergency surfacing procedures. Mission completed successfully. All personnel accounted for. No drama, no detailed description of how close they came, no admission that they survived largely through luck and desperation. Just facts, dry and sanitized and suitable for filing in headquarters archives, where they would sit unread by anyone who hadn't lived through similar experiences. The crew gave their own reports to the intelligence debriefers, provided details about ice patterns and weather conditions and observations that might help future missions. They didn't dwell on the crisis moments, the hours of uncertainty, the suffocation and cold and mechanical failures. Those experiences were internalized, became part of their personal history, things they would carry but rarely discuss. U-703 underwent repairs and maintenance as all submarines did between patrols. Worn components were replaced. Mechanical systems were serviced. The hull was inspected for damage from ice impacts and found to be intact, built strong enough to withstand the forces they had subjected her to. Supplies were replenished. New orders were issued. Within weeks, she was ready for the next mission. She completed several more patrols through 1943 and into 1944, a mix of Arctic supply runs and brief forays into the Norwegian Sea looking for convoy targets that were increasingly well protected and difficult to attack successfully. The crew rotated as military personnel always rotated, some men transferring to other boats or other duties, new men arriving to replace them, the institutional knowledge and experience being preserved even as individual faces changed. The boat earned no particular fame, sank no capital ships, participated in no major battles that would be written about in history books. She was simply a working submarine doing necessary tasks in a war that had too many tasks and never enough resources to accomplish them all. On September 3, 1944, while operating near Hammerfest in northern Norway, U-703 was detected by RAF Coastal Command aircraft conducting routine anti-submarine patrol. The aircraft was a Liberator from 86 Squadron, four-engine heavy bomber adapted for maritime work, carrying depth charges and trained crew who knew how to find and kill submarines. U-703 was on the surface, charging batteries in area that should have been safe from Allied air activity, but that turned out not to be safe at all. The aircraft attacked before U-703 could fully dive, released depth charges in a pattern calculated to bracket a submerging submarine, explosions that detonated at preset depths with force meant to crush pressure hulls. The charges found their mark. U-703 was mortally wounded, hull breached, water flooding into multiple compartments, boat losing buoyancy and control. She went down quickly in deep water off the Norwegian coast. 44 men died, the entire crew, no survivors to swim to surface or be rescued by nearby vessels. They died doing their duty, died as thousands of U-boat crewmen died during the war, died in seconds or minutes depending on where they were in the boat when hull integrity failed and the ocean poured in. The wreck of U-703 has never been found. She lies somewhere on the bottom of the Norwegian Sea, depth and exact position unknown, one more submarine in a war where hundreds of submarines were lost and where most wrecks remain undiscovered. There is no memorial, no marker, no way to visit the place where 44 men drew their last breaths. Just ocean and cold and the slow process of steel dissolving back into the elements over decades and centuries. The weather stations that U-703 helped supply continued operating into 1945, maintained by crews who grew thinner and more desperate as supply runs became rarer, and then stopped completely as Germany collapsed, and the U-boat service was destroyed, and the entire infrastructure that sustained Arctic operations fell apart. Some stations were evacuated in the final chaotic months of the war. Some were simply abandoned as crews gave up hope and tried to make their way to civilization on their own. One station, Haudigen, located on Nordislandet in the Svalbard archipelago, wasn't evacuated until September 4, 1945, more than 4 months after Germany's unconditional surrender. The 11-man crew there didn't know the war had ended until a Norwegian sealing vessel stumbled across them, found German soldiers still dutifully recording weather data and transmitting reports to command centers that no longer existed. They became the last German military unit to surrender, forgotten men in a forgotten theater who had spent years watching weather patterns and waiting for supply submarines that stopped coming. The Arctic Weather War is not taught in history classes. It appears in no documentary films, inspires no memorials or museums, lives in no popular memory of World War II. The submarines that supplied the stations, the men who endured isolation and cold and danger, the close calls and near disasters and moments of desperation, all of it faded into obscurity, buried in classified documents and patrol reports that sit in archives that few people ever visit and fewer still actually read. U-703's experience trapped beneath the ice was never publicized, never made it into propaganda or post-war histories. The patrol report survived in Kriegsmarine archives, was captured by Allied forces after the war, was eventually filed in military history collections where researchers might find it if they knew to look and had reason to care. The crew members who survived that particular patrol and who went on to later patrols spoke rarely if ever about their experience beneath the ice, partly because submarine operations were classified, and partly because the memory was probably too intense to discuss comfortably. The men who died when the boat was finally sunk took their stories with them to the bottom of the Norwegian Sea. But the story matters anyway, not because it changed the outcome of the war. It didn't, not directly, not in any measurable way. U-703's supply run kept one weather station operational for a few more months, provided data that informed some decisions that may or may not have affected tactical outcomes. Not because it represents heroism in any traditional propaganda sense. The crew were doing their jobs, following orders, completing assigned missions like millions of other military personnel across all theaters of the war. The story matters because it reveals something fundamental about human nature, about what people will endure when duty and mission and simple stubborn refusal to surrender demand it. The Arctic didn't care about the war. It didn't care about Germany or Britain or the Allies or the Axis, or any of the political and ideological conflicts that drove men to kill each other across half the planet. The Arctic existed as it had existed for millions of years before humans evolved, and as it would exist for millions of years after humans were gone, indifferent, ancient, hostile to life in all its forms. The temperature was -40 because that's what physics demanded. The ice formed and shifted because that's what water does at those temperatures under those pressures. Nothing personal, nothing targeted, just nature being nature, existing according to principles that predated human civilization and would outlast it. And humans entered it anyway, built stations anyway, sent submarines beneath the ice anyway, risked death by suffocation and cold and equipment failure anyway. Not because they were suicidal or irrational, but because we are a species that fundamentally refuses to accept the limits that nature tries to impose on us. We see hostile environment and we enter it. We encounter conditions that should kill us and we develop technology and techniques to survive them. We face odds that rational analysis says are impossible, and we attempt them anyway, because attempting the impossible is part of what defines human nature. U-703 wasn't special among submarines. Her crew weren't heroes in the traditional sense, weren't awarded medals or recognized in propaganda or remembered in post-war celebrations. They were technicians, operators, ordinary men doing dangerous work because someone had to do it and they happened to be the ones assigned. When nature tried to kill them through ice and cold and mechanical failure, they adapted as best they could. When systems failed, they improvised solutions with whatever materials and knowledge they had available. When options ran out and desperation became their situation, they took chances that rational analysis might reject because desperate chances were better than passive surrender to death. They survived that patrol not through luck alone, though luck played its role, but through skill accumulated over years of submarine operations, through experience that taught them how their boat behaved and what she could endure, through the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that military training cultivates, but that ultimately comes from somewhere deeper in human character. They knew rescue wouldn't come if they failed beneath that ice. They knew that if they died there, nobody would know exactly where or how, that they would simply become another U-boat listed as missing and presumed lost, another crew that sailed out and never returned. And still they fought, against the environment that wanted them dead, against equipment failures that compounded their dangers, against rising CO2 levels and depleting batteries and frozen mechanisms, and the creeping certainty that they might not survive this time, that their luck might have finally run out in the worst possible place. They fought because the alternative was death, and humans generally don't surrender to death easily, don't go quietly into whatever darkness waits beyond life. When people think of World War II submarines, they imagine dramatic battles, wolf packs hunting convoys in the North Atlantic, depth charge attacks that shook boats and terrified crews, torpedo spreads fired at merchant ships or warships, the tension of waiting to see if weapons would hit or miss. They imagine the drama and violence and clear narratives of combat where there are winners and losers and outcomes that can be measured in tonnage sunk or battles won. They don't imagine submarines trapped beneath Arctic ice, slowly suffocating, desperately trying to find thin spots where emergency surfacing might be possible before battery power ran out and life support failed. They don't imagine the forgotten supply missions to weather stations that nobody knew existed, the careful navigation through ice fields where one wrong decision could trap you permanently, the psychological toll of weeks spent in a steel tube in the Arctic winter, where darkness and cold were constants, and human contact was reduced to the same small group of men who had become simultaneously your family and your prison. This was war without glory, war without victory parades, war where success was measured simply by surviving another day, by completing the mission and making it back to port alive. No medals were issued for successfully resupplying a weather station. No recognition came for navigating through ice fields or surviving near disaster beneath the pack ice. The only reward was getting to go out on the next patrol and do it all again, knowing that each patrol reduced the statistical probability of ever returning, that the odds were catching up to everyone, that death was patient and would eventually win. The Arctic remembers none of it. The ice that trapped U-703 has melted and reformed countless times since 1943, part of the eternal cycle of freezing and thawing that has continued unchanged by human history. The leads they navigated have opened and closed thousands of times. The weather stations are gone now, some dismantled, some collapsed, some slowly being reclaimed by tundra and time and the gradual march of entropy. The men who served at those stations are all dead now, the last survivors passing away decades ago, taking their personal memories of isolation and duty and endurance with them. But the story remains, preserved in yellowing documents in military archives, in patrol reports written in clinical language that captures facts but not emotions, in the historical record that scholars can access if they care enough to look. U-703 existed. She operated in the Arctic waters. She nearly died beneath the pack ice in January 1943. She survived through a combination of skill and desperate measures and luck. She completed her mission, delivered the supplies, kept men at a remote weather station alive for a few months more. And then, 16 months later, she was sunk by enemy action with all hands lost, becoming one more casualty in a war that consumed millions. The patrol log doesn't convey the terror of those hours beneath the ice. It doesn't describe the taste of the air as CO2 levels rose, or the sound of men breathing too hard in the silence, or the feeling in everyone's chest as they waited for batteries to die and suffocation to begin. It doesn't capture the moment of impact when conning tower hit ice, or the sound of ice cracking, or the surge of relief when they broke through to surface. All of that lived only in the memories of the men who experienced it, and they took those memories to their graves when U-703 went down off the Norwegian coast. But we can imagine it. We can reconstruct it from the bare facts in official records, from understanding of submarine operations, from knowledge of Arctic conditions, from empathy that lets us connect across decades to men in desperate situations. We can honor it even though they would probably say there was nothing particularly honorable about it, that they were just doing their jobs, that anyone in their position would have done the same. Some battles aren't fought with guns or torpedoes or bombs. They're fought against time and environment and the fundamental hostility of nature toward human life. They're fought in places where victory means nothing more than surviving to fight another day, where the only witness is the planet that tried to kill you, and the only recognition is your own knowledge that you refused to quit even when quitting would have been understandable. U-703 fought that battle, won it temporarily, lost it eventually in different circumstances. The crew members who survived the ice lived a few months more, served a few more patrols, then died together when their boat was destroyed. They exist now only in records and reconstructed history, names on casualty lists, photographs if any survived, memories in families that have mostly forgotten the details of how their ancestors died. The Arctic stands eternal, indifferent, unchanged by human drama. The ice forms and melts and forms again. The temperature drops and rises in seasonal cycles that predate human civilization. The winds blow without caring who they blow against. And somewhere deep beneath the Norwegian Sea, the wreck of U-703 slowly dissolves back into iron and rust and elements, home to whatever creatures live at those depths, tomb to 44 men who sailed into hostile waters and never returned. Their story deserves remembering even if they would say it doesn't. The forgotten Arctic theater deserves recognition even if it contributed nothing dramatic to the war's outcome. The weather stations and supply missions and near disasters beneath the ice all deserve to be part of how we understand World War II, because war was never just the famous battles and well-known campaigns. It was also the countless small missions and dangerous tasks and moments of desperation that nobody recorded for history, but that shaped the lives and deaths of the men who experienced them. The ghosts of U-703 are silent now, as silent as the Arctic that tried to claim them. But their story remains, whispered in archives, reconstructed from fragments, remembered by historians who care about the forgotten corners of history. A reminder that some of the hardest battles are fought where nobody is watching, where success means nothing more than living through the day, where the only witness is the indifferent planet that tried and failed to erase you. Until it succeeded.